Ever get that feeling when you're reading about history?
Yeah.
Like something's missing, like you're only getting half the story.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the big picture, the kings and queens, the battles,
Yeah.
all that. But what about the everyday folks? Like, how did they actually live through all that upheaval?
And that's what we're diving into today, the world of a Tudor woman. Right around the 1540s, we're going deep with Francesca Kay's book, The Book of Days. It's based on an interview she did on the Not Just the Tudors podcast. Really fascinating stuff.
What really grabs me about Kay's approach is how much effort she puts into finding an authentic voice. I mean, in the interview, she talks about rewriting the opening section like over 60 times.
60 times. Wow, that's dedication. Really shows how much she wanted to get it right.
She even compares it to developing a photograph. At first it's all blurry, but then gradually all the details start coming into focus, and that's how we experience her protagonist's world too.
So it's not like we're just suddenly dropped into the 16th century. It's more like we're easing into it, seeing things through her eyes.
Exactly. And that's where the novel structure comes in. It's written as a journal, which, as Kay points out, is pretty rare for a woman of that era.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How many stories from women back then are just gone because they couldn't or didn't write them down?
It's a thought, isn't it? And it makes Kay's commitment to authenticity even more important. She even goes as far as making sure all the language fits the time period.
I read somewhere that even a word like pedal didn't exist in English until way later.
Right. It's a small thing. But it shows how deep her research goes, that dedication to creating a truly immersive experience. She really wanted to take us back to that time, and I think she pulled it off.
Speaking of taking us back, the novel doesn't shy away from the tougher parts of Tudor life. Kay explores the constant threat of death, especially for women during childbirth. The protagonist loses her newborn, which sadly wasn't uncommon back then.
And it really affects her. Kay mentions how scared the protagonist is of becoming homeless if her husband dies. Shows how vulnerable women were back then.
It's a stark reminder of how much women depended on men for their safety, for security.
Absolutely. They had very little control over their own lives,
Well,
especially if they were widowed. One thing that stands out in the novel is the focus on building a tomb for the protagonist and her husband.
yeah, not your typical love story, is it? I was definitely intrigued by that.
Might seem odd at first, but it's actually based on a real tomb. The Duchess of Suffolk's tomb in Oxfordshire. Kay was clearly fascinated by it. She goes into such detail about the construction, the sculptor's process. It's vivid.
And that's what makes this deep dive so engaging. It's not just a book report, We're getting a glimpse into Kay's mind, her research, her passion.
And it's not all grand tombs and historical figures either. Kay gets into the everyday beliefs and superstitions that shaped people's lives back then.
Like, you mean like the fern seed that makes you invisible on Midsummer's Eve?
Yeah.
I've always loved that kind of folklore.
Yeah, exactly. Or the rituals around May Day or St. John's Eve. Kay even tells a story about her own school days. Girls trying to see their future husbands in mirrors on Midsummer's Day.
It's amazing, right? How these old beliefs, even if we don't really believe them anymore, still hold a certain power.
They tap into something deeper, something beyond logic. And in the context of the novel, it adds another layer of realism to the world Kay's built. But maybe the biggest element, and one that really hits home today, is the religious turmoil Kay weaves throughout the story.
Right. England shifting from Catholicism to Protestantism under Henry VIII and Edward VI. Huge changes. Lots of uncertainty.
Kay describes it perfectly. The world is turning faster than a weather vane in a gale. Imagine trying to live through that. Everything you thought you knew about the world, faith, your place in it all, suddenly up in the air.
Must have been terrifying for some. Maybe exciting for others. Probably confusing for most.
And these changes weren't just theoretical debates either. They had a real impact, especially on how churches looked.
Imagine walking into your church, a place you've known your whole life, a place of comfort, and suddenly all the paintings, the statues, all gone. Just the 10 Commandments staring back at you.
It would be jarring, to say the least, especially for those who couldn't read. They lost all those visual stories, those familiar images.
Almost like a kind of sensory deprivation, isn't it? And Kay really gets into the different ways people reacted to this religious shift. It wasn't just black and white, Acceptance or rejection.
Exactly. Some characters are excited about the new ideas, while others are clinging to the old ways, mourning the loss of their rituals, their familiar objects, and then there are those stuck in the middle trying to make sense of it all.
It's a human response, isn't it, to such massive change. And it's something we can still relate to today. as we deal with our own shifting landscapes, in our personal lives, in society as a whole.
It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about reflecting on what it means to be human, our struggles with faith, change, and loss.
And speaking of loss, there's a really powerful moment in the interview. Kate talks about how important rosary beads were for women back then. She says, "The women of this village will never own necklaces of rubies. They will only ever have their precious rosary beads."
That line, it's stuck with me, speaks volumes about how little women had back then, but also about how important their faith was. Those few objects that held meaning.
Those beads were more than just a religious symbol. They offered comfort, a connection to something bigger, maybe even a reminder of loved ones who were gone.
And then the Reformation comes along. And even those small comforts are threatened, adding another layer of loss and uncertainty.
It makes you wonder, how did people cope? How did they find meaning and comfort in all that turmoil?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, and that's exactly what we'll be diving into after a quick break.
We were just talking about how the Reformation really shook things up, like it took away those traditional ways people dealt with loss and uncertainty. Makes you wonder, what filled that gap? What new ways of finding meaning came about?
That's a really good question. And it's something Kay explores in the novel, but in a subtle way. You see, while the protagonist is struggling with the loss of those comforting rituals, she also starts finding some solace in the new Protestant ideas, about having a more personal connection with God.
So it's not all about just loss.
Right.
Right. It's also about change, about things transforming. The old ways are being challenged, yeah, but new ways of thinking and believing are starting to take root.
Exactly. And this shift, it shows up not just in the characters' inner lives, but also in the world around them. Remember we talked about how churches were visually transformed? Well, Kay doesn't just describe that change, she digs deeper. She looks at the implications.
She's saying that moving away from the visual, from images and icons, and going towards a faith that's more based on text, that had a lasting impact on English culture as a whole.
That's it. She even connects it to how English literature blossomed. The language of Shakespeare, the King James Bible, all coming out of this shift. It's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, it really makes you think, right? Like, maybe the way we think and express ourselves today is it somehow shaped by those big cultural and religious shifts that happened way back then.
Definitely. It highlights how intertwined faith, art, and language really are. But let's get back to the novel for a sec. One thing that stood out to me was how Kay portrays the monarchs behind all these changes. Henry VIII and his son, Edward VI.
You're right. She never actually refers to them by name. It's like they're this huge presence looming over the story, but we only experience their impact through the eyes of the regular people, not from their own actions or words.
It's a clever way to tell the story. It makes us think about how those massive shifts in power and belief would have felt to the everyday people caught in the middle of it all.
And for the protagonist, her view of Henry VIII is, well, it's pretty personal.
You mean how she sees him mainly as the man who caused the death of his wives? The man who brought so much grief and instability to families?
Yeah, exactly. It's a far cry from those romanticized or political portrayals we usually get of Henry VIII. Kay reminds us that to many people, he was a figure of fear and sadness.
A good reminder that history is always seen through someone's eyes. It's subjective, filtered through individual experience. And speaking of individual experience, there's another thing I wanted to bring up. The whole theme of death and how it was dealt with in Tudor England. Kay really goes deep on this in the interview.
Yeah, she doesn't shy away from how present death was back then. It was a constant shaping people's lives and beliefs in really profound ways.
And what's interesting is how Kay contrasts the Tudor view of death with our own modern sensibilities. How we tend to see death as something to be scared of, something to avoid, even deny.
Yeah, but in Tudor England, death was much more a part of everyday life. They had all those elaborate rituals and practices to help them deal with loss, to make sure souls passed safely into the afterlife.
Kay even suggests that this close relationship with death, while obviously tough, might have actually offered a strange kind of comfort. The dead weren't seen as completely gone, more like present in a different way.
Right, she mentions all those rituals. Praying for the dead, singing for them, saying their names, all meant to keep their memory alive and ease the pain of separation.
And then with the Reformation, a lot of those rituals disappeared. People were left to deal with death in a new way, and it was often unsettling.
Like they were stripped of those comforting structures and practices that had helped them make sense of loss for centuries.
And Kay suggests that this loss might have actually made grief even stronger. It's a powerful idea. Sometimes letting go of old ways, even if they're not serving us anymore, it can leave a void that's hard to fill.
Makes you think about what we've lost and gained in our own way of approaching death and dying today.
It's a good question to think about, for sure. I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about the religious upheaval, the societal norms, the constant presence of death, and how resilient humans can be in the face of it all.
And we've done it all through the lens of this amazing novel, The Book of Days. It captures both the grand sweep of history and the small, intimate details of daily life in Tudor England.
And that's maybe the biggest takeaway from our deep dive. History isn't just dates and battles, it's about people, their stories, their struggles, their victories.
And sometimes it's through those individual stories that we really learn the most about the past and about ourselves. We've really been digging into some heavy stuff in this deep dive with Francesca Kay's The Book of Days, the religious changes, societal norms, even death. But what I keep coming back to is just how rich it is, like how Kay weaves all these historical details with these really personal human moments.
Yeah, I agree. It's not just, spitting out facts. She makes the era come alive through the senses. Those vivid descriptions, even those little bits of folklore, it adds this touch of magic and mystery.
It's like that image of the fern seed,
Yeah.
right? Making you invisible on Midsummer's Eve. It's like a time when the real and the supernatural were much closer.
Exactly. It taps into something, I don't know, primal in us, something beyond logic. Even if we don't believe in fern seeds, we're still drawn to those stories, those glimpses of a world where anything could happen.
It's that mix, that historical accuracy and the imaginative storytelling that makes Kay's work so good. And you see it in how she describes the tomb, too, the one inspired by the real Duchess of Suffolk's tomb in Oxfordshire.
Oh, the detail is incredible. She talks about everything. The sculptor's process, the sketches, the materials, even the symbolism in every little thing.
You feel like you're right there in the workshop watching it all come together.
And remember that part about the frescoes? The hidden ones they found under the Duchess's tomb? You could only see them with modern photography. It's like history is always hiding something new, waiting to be discovered.
Speaking of hidden things, the interview with Kay gave us a peek into her creative process, too. She talked about how tough it was to find that authentic voice for her protagonist, a woman living through such a turbulent time.
Yeah, and she didn't just phone it in either. Remember how she said she rewrote that opening section like 60 times?
That's serious dedication right there.
Yeah.
She wanted to get inside that character's head, make her voice feel real.
And I think that's why this novel and this deep dive are so rewarding. It's not just about learning dates and names. It's about connecting with the human stories behind it all.
It's about putting ourselves in their shoes,
Yeah.
experiencing the world through their eyes, feeling their joys and sorrows.
And when we do that, we get a better understanding, not just of the past, but of ourselves, too. We see that even though times have changed, we still share those basic hopes, fears, and dreams with the people who came before us.
So if this deep dive has gotten you curious about Tudor England, or about women's lives back then, or just about how resilient humans can be, you should really check out Francesca Kay's The Book of Days. It's worth the read.
And if you enjoyed this exploration of history and culture and the human experience, well, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive. We've got more fascinating conversations and deep dives coming your way. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.